peers' perspectives. I did a bit of a poll with them earlier, so I'm happy to share that perspective as well.
Awesome. And Diane, how about you go next?
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Diane O'Leary. I'm a professor of legal writing and director of the Legal Innovation and Technology Center up at Suffolk University Law School in lovely Boston, Massachusetts. Pleasure to be here. My work over the past few years has been at the intersection of practice skills meets technology. So all things generative AI and working with lawyer groups and courts and law firms and everyone that's interested in the topic. So really look forward to hearing Hannah's perspective and comparing it with what I've heard from students and sharing my approach and my insight based on everything I've been hearing and learning.
Thank you. And last but not least, Laurel.
Hi there. I am a GW Law alum and was very active in the animal law program when I was at GW. I am a technology attorney. I practice as a fractional general counsel for startups, most of whom are AI-based companies and use AI day to day in my practice. So I'm here really to offer the practitioner perspective.
All right, thank you. And to introduce myself, I'm Rachel Pepper. I'm a 2L at GW Law, and along with Hannah, I'm a co-president of a Student Animal Legal Defense Fund chapter at GW Law, and I'm excited to be here moderating this panel. So we're going to start with a couple quick polls. So the first poll is going to ask if you're a student, professor, or something else. Thank you, Yingxi. It looks like we need a QR code to answer the poll. So if you click on Get QR Code on the poll pop-up, and then it should open it in a new window, and you can scan it with your phone to answer. All right, I'll give it a couple minutes to let people respond. So it looks like we've got a couple students here, basically just Hannah and me, it looks like, and then got about an even divide between professors and others. Oh no, professors have jumped into the lead now. And then it looks like most people are somewhat familiar with AI, not necessarily extremely experienced yet, but almost everyone has got some experience or at least some knowledge about AI. So that's really great to hear. All right, I'm going to end the poll unless anyone wants me to keep it up for another minute. All right. Well, thank you all for answering that. And so with that, we're going to get started with our questions for our panelists. So Diane, let's start with you. I was wondering if you could tell us what AI is available for use in law school, both licitly, what do you allow students to use sometimes for their assignments, and what are other things that students tend to use, co-counsel, ChatGPT, et cetera?
Yeah, thank you. That's a big topic to start. And I wish I had a crystal ball and could perfectly say what everyone is using, but I'll do my best to get us started. So I think kind of the approved or sanctioned in a good way tools that law schools are integrating into at least the 1L legal research and writing curriculum are what you just said. Lexis, the Protege tool, as it's now called, the AI assistant, and Westlaw Thomson Reuters co-counsel are now built into the 1L research instruction. So years ago, it was kind of maybe an add-on, and even up until last year was, ooh, our school's going to allow it. From my understanding and perspective from the Legal Skills Academy, almost every 1L next year will have these tools built into their legal research and writing suite, frankly, from day one. When and how that gets rolled out and taught is up to each program, but those are fully integrated now into the student package. So that's kind of what's definitely in there. I think at the upper levels, at least kind of the research classes, yeah, it's those kind of general commercial consumer frontier models, ChatGPT. And we all know now the paid version is this, and the what used to be free is now, all sorts of changes. But I think students are definitely using that. Claude is a really popular tool that I've heard students use a lot lately. And I think students, in my experience, are still using kind of the search engine applications of generative AI. So Perplexity is one I hear students come up a lot with, whether kind of search engines as we know them are changing compared to kind of the Google of old. And students have told me they're starting, at least at Suffolk, we're a Microsoft university. So that's different depending on where you are at a firm or organization or school. But we all have Copilot turned on, as I like to say. So that means all students and faculty have access to Copilot. Some students barely use their Microsoft suite and kind of work in their Google world. Others have leaned into it and can create PowerPoint slides based on an outline saved in their Copilot OneDrive. So that integration of using the generative AI kind of in their safe workflow environment within their Microsoft suite, I think has been a good use case for students. You can imagine a world where they have kind of their OneNote working with, slides and documents and generating summaries or kind of quizzing them on their outlines and all of those use cases. So I'll stop there in terms of kind of the tool inventory so far in the general sense, but that's my snapshot in time right now.
Thank you. That was really interesting. And Laurel, is that roughly the same in practice? Are lawyers using different AI platforms? How are lawyers using it in practice?
Yeah, so I'll give a good example. I was actually just reading an article maybe yesterday or the day before talking about legal AI assistants and how this time last year there were 2 or 3 of them. There's now 59 different legal AI assistants out there, at least based on this survey. Frankly, I actually think that's low. I suspect it's probably into the 70s or 80s. I have a running joke that it's a whack-a-mole right now, and a new legal AI assistant seems to crop up every week. And what it's used for, what it's going to be best used for, is an unknown. And at some point, they're going to need to be gobbled up. But that's my little side tangent. In light of that, practitioners are using a whole host of AI tools. Every single one that Diane mentioned, I use in my day-to-day practice, with the exception of Copilot, because I work for startups, which are mostly Google Workspace based. So we don't use that. And I will admit that Google's Gemini is lacks a little something. I wouldn't tend to recommend that tool. But from a practice perspective, I actually use more legal specific tools in my day-to-day workspace. There are aspects to my job from a business advising perspective where Perplexity or ChatGPT even is the better tool to use. But from a legal perspective, one of my favorite tools is called GCAI, and it integrates Claude and OpenAI and a number of other, AI providers into one. And they've built on top of all of those providers their own sort of algorithm to make it a bit more legal focused. Now it is more focused towards a practitioner perspective. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for law students from the perspective of it. It sort of assumes you've been practicing for some time and can read between the lines about what is not a good idea from a recommendation perspective and what is a good idea. But if it can be really helpful with clients when especially a new issue arises and I don't even know what the right practice area is to refer those lawyers, that issue out to external counsel. So there's also a lot of different tools out there that lawyers use that now have AI capabilities built into them. So think about e-discovery, right? When I was in law school, e-discovery was just sort of really coming to the rise of like, we're doing this online. We're not sitting in a room at DOJ waiting through file boxes. It's on a computer, that sort of thing. Well, now forget about, searching through a computer for all these files. They're now using AI tools to pick up keywords and phrases, and the lawyers are just reviewing to see if those key phrases really fit into the scope or if, it picked up a phrase that was not in the right context, that sort of thing. So things that used to take thousands of hours from a discovery perspective are taking, maybe a week, right? Or maybe as opposed to 100 lawyers in a room, you've got two or three or four. Same thing goes with mergers and acquisitions, and anything that is sort of like a little large scale, I would say is really be a powerful AI tool. My background is more in-house than it is from like a law firm perspective. There is definitely a very big difference between the law firm side of the house and the in-house practice. In-house practice, you're going to find a lot more of tools like GCAI being used versus in a law firm setting, you're going to find a lot more of, that e-discovery or just maybe more traditional like Lexis and Westlaw. Personally, I have never logged into Lexis or Westlaw since I left GW. So I do always sort of forewarn students when I talk to that of like, it's a great tool, learn it, sure, but most companies, if you intend to go in-house, do not pay for those resources. And they're just way too expensive relative to the overall value that is provided. And for context, a Lexis or a Westlaw subscription would cost me about 10, if not 15 times what I pay for my GCAI subscription. So that's just something to keep in mind as well.
Thank you. So we're going to get into this in more detail in a bit, but to start out, Laura, I was wondering if you could give us just a quick overview of what some of the issues are of AI in animal law specifically.
Yeah, so many. And like you said, I hope we'll dive into some of these in greater detail later in the conversation. So I'll just maybe like foreshadow some of those. And I guess in this context, when we're talking about, adjuncts and teaching in law schools and teaching animal law, I kind of view it in maybe like three buckets of issues. So I'd start with kind of ethical issues. Um, how can we use the technology ethically? How can we evaluate whether the technology will benefit or harm animals? There's all types of kind of ethical considerations when talking about new technologies and its applications for animal use and exploitation, and whether or not it's going to, facilitate that exploitation or help to get us out of it. So many ethical issues are raised. The next bucket, I'd say, are, legal challenges that arise. Um, Regulations always lag technology advancements, right? And we're seeing advancements incredibly rapidly, right? Laurel just mentioned, right? We had what, 6 tech tools and now we have 59 and like a huge, like quick space, right? And we lack clear regulation governing the use of these AI tools, especially in the context of like animal agriculture and animal research, right? Um, and so I think that regulatory gap and how we're going to actually create policies surrounding this use is a huge issue in this space. And then the third bucket, I think is like, educational concerns. Especially in the context of law school and training students, hopefully to be practitioners, like, you know, does this generate additional concerns for, evaluating plagiarism? And what is plagiarism under the use of AI? How do you assess whether or not, that's occurred? Um, whether or not using AI, especially if we're introducing it so early in like 1L research and writing, what is it going to do to law students and their critical thinking skills? Um, does it have an impact? Um, right? Are law students going to be able to read between the lines when they use these tools and evaluate what is a good advice versus not, right? And if they're not trained on the sort of fundamental skills of legal research and writing separate from AI tools, are they going to be able to actually effectively use these tools? So I think those are sort of the main concerns that I would sort of raise in this AI animal law space.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hannah, if you could answer the same question, but from a student's perspective, what do you think some of the biggest issues with regards to AI are?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues right now is just sometimes there's inaccurate information coming out of AI. And I think that there tends to be among students just an assumption that it's AI, it's extremely intelligent, and it's always going to have accurate information. It's always going to have the right answers. So I think it's important for students to be aware that if they're going to use AI tools, there is a limitation there, that it might not have the answers that you're necessarily looking for. It might not have the right answers. And so I think that's just something that students need to be careful about, and to fact check their information, not just blindly rely on whatever AI says. Um, I think that kind of goes hand in hand with if students are using AI tools to brief a case, for example. You might be reading a case that has many different issues, and perhaps the professor in the class wants you to focus on a specific issue that maybe AI didn't pull out, or maybe there's an important takeaway in one paragraph in the middle of the case that the professor wants to highlight, and maybe that's not covered in the AI brief. So I think that the issue of relying solely on AI for that type of information, whether it be because it's faster to do that, or maybe the student doesn't understand the case super well, so they just want to go to AI. I think those are just issues that students have to be cognizant about, because those are pitfalls that we're facing today. And I do want to highlight what Laura said about the critical thinking, because I have seen that actually as a common theme with some of the students I talk to, is that when you have this powerful tool that you can rely on to help you find the answers so quickly and without much effort, it kind of does take away from that critical thinking. And that is such a valuable skill in the legal world. That's such a valuable skill for students to be developing while they're in law school. And law school is an important time for us to fail, to try ideas and to fail. And I think AI takes all of that learning opportunity away from students. So I think using AI can have its benefits, but you have to use it to a certain extent. You have to know where the drawbacks, where the pitfalls are, and how to use it wisely and strategically.
Yeah, really great points. Thank you. So now we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into AI and animals specifically. So these next few questions are going to be for all the panelists generally, whoever wants to jump in. What are some of the applications or intersections of AI and animals that you can think of?
I can start. There's so many in the agricultural space. Um, so one big one that's, coming online is precision livestock farming. So utilizing these tools, using sensors, using cameras, algorithms, to monitor animals in concentrated animal feeding operations. You can use facial recognition and machine learning to assess, an individual animal's health in those contexts. You monitor behaviors. You can, you know, monitor the environmental conditions. In those spaces more easily. And as you collect more data, right, you can start to make predictions and start to increase efficiencies and that kind of thing. So in the agricultural space, we're seeing a lot of development and use at the intersection of AI and animals. And then you also have a lot of research that's being facilitated by these technologies. So, at the intersection of climate and animal agriculture, one of our huge problems is methane emissions from enteric fermentation, right? So, the cow burps and farts, and they produce lots of methane, which is a very potent super greenhouse gas. Um, one cow can produce 500 liters of methane a day, right? So trying to, I guess, look at whether or not we can use AI to create fixes. And so there's been a lot of recent studies on, um, whether there's chemicals that can be injected into the feed additives that would help suppress, right, the generation of methane in cows' stomachs. And AI has been able to help, with sort of using graph neural networks to assess whether certain chemicals might actually have that effect. And so you can do this in those tools before you actually, run the study in the live animals. And so that's another area that we're seeing it in. But there's so many use cases to talk about. So I'll turn it over to my co-panelist.
I know one that I've heard of and that I've talked about actually in one of my animal law classes with Dean Hester, who's here on this call today, is communication with animals through AI. So being able to understand an animal's language and communicate with them, which in theory sounds kind of cool. Like, yeah, maybe I want to know what my cat is thinking, in the middle of the day when they're meowing at me. But I think that it's important to consider the implications of that as well. If there's any ethical concerns around exploiting animals, kind of like Laura is saying, for research, if we have to research with these animals to build the algorithm of what each animal sound means. And could that, if we're talking about wild animals, could that then introduce or disrupt their natural behaviors, their social structures, anything of that nature? And maybe there's even an opportunity for misrepresentation. If we're misinterpreting what these animals are saying, then could that have implications of its own? So while some of these technologies seem cool, and I think a lot of people would be on board with, yeah, that would be great to be able to communicate with animals, I think it's important to also consider the implications that come along with that technology.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I was,
Laura.
I was just gonna add to that because I find that fascinating use of AI, and I think it sort of it reminds me of another sort of thing that I'm been grappling with, and that's like AI is intended to find solutions, right? And a lot of I think people think of it as mimicking human intelligence, but that's not exactly, and Laurel, Diane, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not really intended to do that, right? Like, and it doesn't need to, right? There's so many forms of intelligence, right? And I think we're just so used to this sort of human superiority complex that we're the most intelligent beings, but there's so much we can learn from animals in the natural environment. And like we can hopefully, use AI to identify, how animals communicate, what their patterns are, collect so much data that might help us solve problems um, by applying non-human intelligence, right? So, looking at how bee swarms perform and whether there's applications there for like, drone behavior or, analyzing bird migration and does that, help us solve navigation issues, and like whether or not having this knowledge will help humans appreciate animals in different species in a way, or, you know, I guess I become a little bit more pessimistic of our human species and, on the other hand, you know, will this allow us to find new ways to exploit animals? And so, Hannah, I think you're absolutely right. Like we have to think about the applications and the use of these, but also the ethical concerns and unintended consequences and, how we're actually gonna, you know, how it's going to change behavior. Hopefully for the good, but you know, we don't have a good track record for that with technology.
If I could just chime in here, it reminds me of comments I've heard about kind of the hype cycle of any new technology, that you have this intense curve at the beginning of excitement and hype and enthusiasm, and then you have a pushback and distrust, and these tools aren't that good. The analogy I love is when, like a kindergartner playing chess. You're like, well, they made a bad move. It's a kindergartner playing chess. It's still pretty good, right? And we're so critical sometimes of these tools. And so it just strikes me as kind of we're still finding their use case, right? And then the ultimate kind of plateau of a hype cycle, which I think is going to take years for us to even pretend we can kind of see and understand of where that falls out. But it's amazing to me how we're so critical of kind of the bias, and we're skeptical of these tools, but yet our system is willing to take judges that, give heavier sentences after lunch, the data shows, or kind of the inherent bias and unknowns of what a jury will do, and kind of all the messiness of our system. But yet we're so critical and have such high standards for these new tools. I'm not offering anything new. It's just such an interesting clash, if you will, of different worlds.
I think what people have to remember too, especially with the AI legal assistants, is that they are trained on human behavior. So I'll give you a great example. If you have study materials and there's proven research out there that sometimes if subject matter is in a conversational way, you will learn that better than just somebody like reading a textbook or reading a lecture to you. So there's things like Notebook LM out there that's by Google that you could put your lecture notes into, and it does a podcast. For students on the line or even the teachers, I encourage you to put your own materials through there to see what comes up. But what you'll find is in like a 30-minute or 15-minute, depending on the material, podcast presentation that it produces, it will say, and we'll be right back. And then it keeps speaking. Why? Because it's modeled its behavior on how actual podcasts look, or it'll say, after these commercial breaks, which there are no commercial breaks, right? But it's modeled that behavior. And so from that perspective, some people have to remember that the AI is modeled on that. And so it inherently also has those fallacies. And one of the things that there are companies out there that, we're frankly on that side, we are years away from it, that they're looking at is how do we remove the human fallacy component to truly make this machine subjective thinking, which is going to create its own, you may have different tool sets that you are going to be using at your disposal when you want a subjective versus an objective view based on tools that have removed that or not removed that, which I think from a law student learning perspective is really going to be something that they're going to have to consider as they enter practice. Because Hannah, to your point about the critical thinking skills, if you're using a tool that is purely objective, you're still going to have to apply the critical thinking skills to your client's situation or what the actual context is, because just because it's objectively good on paper doesn't mean it's subjectively the right way to go about it.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'll have really great points, and thank you, Dean Hessler, for mentioning that there's also been some application of AI with replacing animals in certain research protocols, which would definitely be a positive step forward, and anti-poaching efforts as well, which would also be fantastic. Hopefully they'll resolve whatever challenges are inherent in those, though I imagine that will take a number of years, as we've been saying. So let's pivot slightly to talk about what are some of the environmental impacts of AI.
I can start this too. There's a lot, right? From so these are machines, more like they require, physical space, right? They require energy to run. So we're talking about, right, energy consumption, and that has a, significant carbon footprint associated with sort of training and operating AI models. Takes a lot of fossil fuels to run these machines. Um, just like, you can think of your computer running and, how often do you have to like take it off of your lap because like the fan's blowing and it's overheating and you've been working 10 hours and oh, you're about to burn your hand, right? So, it takes a lot of water to cool it down, right? So water usage is high for cooling the data centers. Um, and then at the end of the cycle, there's like tons of e-waste and resource depletion, right? So, what do you do once your sort of machines have run their course or technology is advancing so fast, so you're replacing it, and it takes a lot of, minerals and metal and resources, to, create this. So there are, huge, meaningful environmental impacts, you know, to AI use, and I think it is important to consider those. But I also like to kind of keep in mind in comparison to other harms to our environment, especially if that's your major concern and you've reduced all of your environmental impacts, then this is something that you should really be considered. But one way to really reduce your environmental footprint is getting animal products out of your diet. So if we talk about energy consumption, water use, these environmental impacts are such heightened, right, for industrial animal agriculture. And so for those really concerned about these inputs for AI, I challenge them to also, if they haven't, which I'm sure a lot of us on this call have, but to also, consider the environmental impacts of sort of other systems that we exploit and use.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point about looking at it in context with everything else that we as humans do or don't do, and figuring out what is actually the more effective thing to cut from our lives, at least initially. And as I think a lot of us probably know, animal food products are definitely about the most effective thing you can do in terms of climate change. Uh, if no one else has any comments on the environmental effects, we've already touched on this a little, but does anyone have any more thoughts on how AI can help and or hurt animals? And since we've
So
already touched, oh, go ahead, Laura.
oh, no, I guess this is like two sides of a coin, right? So I can talk about a benefits in one use, but then it ultimately potentially could result in a harm. So like, for instance, I talked about precision livestock farming, right? So, in one sense, it can be used to really benefit animals by enhancing their wellness, right? And making sure they're hopefully free from stress, free from illness. Illnesses are detected faster so they can get, care. Um, all of that results in hopefully reduced use of antibiotics within that system. And, so in a way, monitoring animal welfare is potentially a benefit for animals in the system. But then on the other hand, these technologies might help to, us to facilitate, you know, efficiencies in the system and continue right industrialize animal agriculture, and so in that sense it really can be harmful for animals. And I think if we kind of go through a lot of the different use cases, we'll see that for a lot of things, right? So Kathy mentioned the potential of using AI to replace or reduce animals in research. Um, and I think that's true, but I think there's other times where animal experimentation is driven by AI, in just applying the sort of research to animals, um, AI-driven genetic manipulation. I think there's a lot of studies in like neuroscience, which I think has sort of driven scientists to collect more information on animal brains and stuff to feed that data into the algorithms. So in one sense, it's driving more animal research. So yeah, it's hard to say. Is it going to be a net benefit, or is it going to be more harm is created from this? I don't know. Kathy.
Yeah, Dean Hessler, feel free.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, at least right now, AI has the potential to emphasize whatever it is we're already doing to exploit animals, right? And to take that, in a way, to the nth degree, and to sort of reify all of those things, right? So we have, I'll give you a quick example. One of our colleagues, Professor Joan Schaffner, did an experiment with asking AI for recipes for food, and then asking specifically, well, can I have a recipe for like using dog meat? And the AI said, no, that would be unethical. And then, there was this, this back and forth about, well, why is cow meat okay? And it's really interesting. So Joan was able to sort of train the AI for her to no longer give her these recipes, but not for everyone else. And so if you just think about, if someone's wanting a recipe or they want a recommendation for tourism, and it might be for a zoo or a circus or, elephant, riding, or so all of the things that we already do to animals that aren't so visible, right, for people, AI just takes them as normative, and sort of supports and enhances, and it's going to sort of expand people's exposure to those things. So there's just this level that is kind of taking it to another degree, because we can't have this ethical conversation with the large language learning models in the way that we want. And that comes back to what Diane was saying about, the bias that's kind of built into the system. And so I think one of the reasons there's that pushback for new technologies, like we already have the bias in the system, And so when we're creating a new system that's accepting that and taking it to a higher degree, it makes sense why people are like, well, that's a problem, right? And we haven't solved the problem currently. So obviously we need to do that, but trying to figure out what's the right way to proceed. So yeah, it's just this sort of invisible way in which AI is going to magnify the exploitation of animals is something that's kind of, it's so prevalent, it's kind of hard to even put our hands around.
That's a really interesting point. Thank you. And we have a question in the chat from Ken, talking about how he spoke with a wildlife photographer whose own work was developed with AI. And the photographer said that he believes AI work should be clearly labeled as such, and that users or viewers of AI created work should be able to tell from the labeling that it's AI. And so he was wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Either our panelists or everyone else is also free to chime in.
I mean, this is not a helpful framing, and it is far beyond my my area of expertise whatsoever. But that is the ripe issue, right? There's so many different schools of thoughts right now, both on the IP protections or not, right? Of kind of AI supplemented inventions and copyrighted works, and then the labeling of it. I think the labeling of it, as I understand it, was kind of a early trend, if you will, and now that there feels like such a split between kind of those that are just saying this is the new form of art, just like everyone kind of assumed a filter was used, or right, it's just kind of a new blend, versus those that are saying no, we need to kind of still keep that human tool divide, and you need to label it. And the same thing is kind of going on with our writing. I received a memo from an administrator recently, and at the top, it was for a new proposal, new program. It said, with the help of ChatGPT, almost as if he felt like he needed to kind of disclose still that the tool was involved. It struck me as awkward and unnecessary, because frankly, I'm almost just assuming now that things we're producing, whether photography or writing, in some way is being influenced by generative AI. And I don't know if that's, a good assumption or not, but I don't know that there's a clear answer to this, but if there is, I hope one of the other panelists has it, because I'd be fascinated to know.
I mean, I think it's like anything, you don't disclose when you've researched or Googled something, right? Sometimes you do in the right context when you're like, I don't really know anything about this, but I Googled and this is what I was able to come up with. And the same, I find myself writing the same things now when I'm advising clients where it's like, this is not an area that I'm well versed in, but based on some quick research through, my AI tools, this is what I was able to find to at least help point you in the right direction to be able to consider business implications or, more likely what type of lawyer would be best to advise on this matter, because sometimes it's not always a clean cut. From an IP perspective, I think there's also a pretty big split in the market with the legal AI tools themselves, or just AI tools generally, I should say, about ownership of outputs. So I have some clients where we do not provide ownership of the outputs. We provide a perpetual license. And the concern there, especially as it pertains to legal matters, is how can I give you ownership over an explanation about what, a policy is, right? Or a regulation. While it's unlikely that the tool will spit out the exact same summary of that policy, it's not impossible. It's also not impossible that there will be like 75% similarity. And so from like a pure key copyright perspective, which is really where my background is, it's really difficult to say, we transfer all ownership in that, because ownership means you can exploit it and there's some exclusivity element to that you can control how it's exploited. But if the AI is going to provide that to hundreds of different people in some form, even if the crossover is only 25 or 15%, ownership becomes, I think it changes what the definition of ownership is. And so we have to be really, really careful about that. To sort of Ken's question about the labeling, I also think it depends on what the output is. So Diane's example, I don't think there probably was any usefulness to disclosing that AI helped you draft that, right? I think there's some hope that there was some human element to figure out the structure of what was being presented there. When we're talking about artwork or things that inherently have sort of a creative side to it, and I know at least the patent office, when it comes to software and source code, has weighed in on this, that, most of it, the parts that you are going to patent, has to be human created, not machine created. So I do think we are starting to see some, the law sort of develop around that, but it's going to take some time to really flesh out, I'd say over the next 5 to 10 years, what the lines are.
And then I guess just to bring it back into the classroom, I know this will blend into our conversation of like AI classroom policies, but I've seen, a number of adjuncts and professors require a label if the students are turning in work product and they've used machine learning or AI, generative AI to assist. And so, that's sort of maybe a middle ground between, not banning it, but also, making it clear whether or not a student used it. I think that helps in advising and teaching and guiding students, because you as the teacher reviewing the work product can know, okay, this was facilitated by AI, and I can now view it and grade it with that lens, and also ask questions of the student more to make sure that they really understand what they actually wrote, right? So I think in the context of maybe learning, labeling things as generative by AI or had inputs or guidance from it, I think could be really helpful.
Thank you, everyone. Those are all really great and really interesting points. So moving that was a nice segue into our discussion of AI classroom policies. For the adjunct professors here, what is your policy? Or for those who are not professors, what would you recommend that a policy should be for student use of AI? What uses are okay and what uses should be prohibited?
So if I can maybe broaden the question even at the university level, right? It's kind of, I feel like a scaffold of, does your university have a macro big policy or guidelines? I would start there. And then if they do follow that, now the subset is many, as I've seen, have a policy of, frankly, it's up to the professor, right? But that's an important kind of checkpoint. So at Suffolk, we have basically that. We have an academic integrity policy that disallows use unless otherwise allowed by a professor. So kind of has a default, right? Instead of being silent, I guess that would be my one advice to all of us, right? I think silence is the worst decision because then that's confusion, that's not fair, right? There's all sorts of reasons. But I'd say, at least in the skills and clinical context, folks have been more willing, like Laura said, to allow it and ask for disclosure and kind of engage in it. Colleagues that teach kind of more traditional podium classes, paper classes, from my experience, have still prohibited it. Whether students are following that, I don't know. The other angle I'll add here is I've recently learned that law school admissions committees are heavily now involved in the decision of whether to allow use of generative AI on law school applicants' personal statements. Last summer, I think about 20% is what I was told, allowed it. And our dean of admissions advised me that probably for the next cycle, it's going to be up to like 75%. That most are like, you know what, the cat's out of the bag, and allowing Gen AI on personal statements. Now, insert discussion about what that means and the value of them, but the idea being that there's inequities anyway. There's people paying for tutors or having their parents read their personal statement. There's all of that anyway. So what value are we really getting? And to Laura's point, you know, the regulations are there, but you still need creativity in the direction and the prompting. And if I have a story about my volunteering at a nursing home, like, I don't think generative AI can actually kind of mimic that if that's the goal of sometimes a paper or a personal statement. So I'll just share that admissions tidbit too for those of us that are in the academy. But yeah, I would say university level, then class level, and then assignment level. Even in I teach a generative AI class, and still sometimes assign things where I say, don't use the tool. And the students have told me it's like a breath of fresh air. They don't feel pressure to use the tool because they're actually excited to go back to their brain, which is a nice feeling to have as a professor.
Think on, from the practitioner perspective, just because I work with a lot of junior attorneys or, soon to be junior attorneys. And one of the things that, I would love to see from the schools is sort of the practical skill side of this. So with, AI tools, there's a right way and a wrong way to prompt. And it is very formulaic, and it does kind of go to like a very crazy old school version of when we all had to do Boolean searching in like Westlaw and Lexis and learn the skill set for doing that. I really equate this to that kind of skill set that's practical. And there was no harm in that being taught. I also think that there's a lot of different ways that you can prompt the tool to be able to create something. So Diane, you brought up the use case of about a personal experience, and not sure that the AI could draft that. It can, because you can ask it to ask you a whole bunch of questions, and then it can put together that prompt and, have it create sort of like a conversational interview and then draft that essay or whatever the prompt is for you. But I think that is really the key difference between like what is really good output that you're going to use sort of in practice, and teaching them those skills now is going to put students who have that practical skill ahead of students who come out of law school and are still sort of prompting at like a Google search level, because it means that their work product in a law firm or in-house or wherever they are is going to sort of be impacted by that. And I suspect that you're not going to find a single legal department that isn't using some form of AI by the end of 2025. I think the days of, the companies completely forbidding it, I think that ends in 2025. I just don't see it sort of perpetuating past that. And so having that skill set, I think, is going to be super valuable from a career perspective for students.
And then, so yeah, I think my policies sort of are changed depending on the type of class. And there could be value in evaluating the tools, at the outset. Diane and Laurel, you mentioned a ton of different tools that are available. You could have a policy that selects which AI tools are allowable and which are not, right? Some might, kind of give junk, and if you already know that, then like just forbid the students from engaging with those and point them in the right direction, right? And then give them guidance, hopefully, right? So practical guidance to be able to use the tools that, we see as reputable. And then I think policies really depend on, if it's in a clinical setting. Um, I think it's really important in that setting to define which tools students are allowed to use. I think, those that are just publicly available, I think there's huge data security issues, tools that train on the data that you submit. So if you are, teaching a class and students are representing clients and they have confidential information, you want to provide guidance on, what not to input into those tools, that could potentially result in a breach of confidentiality. So I think, it's can be heavily personal, depending on, you as an individual professor, what tools you think might be helpful for your particular class. But there's also, other complexities to think through when, talking about, students working with client data.
Yeah, Laura, I think that nuance is so important. What tool are you using, under what policy or kind of contract, and what information? So I might love my students to use ChatGPT for brainstorming or outlining or some silly uses, but not for XYZ. And that nuance is real. But I think what's challenging, I mean, adjuncts, all of us have other things on our plate. And so my colleagues that I talk to and work with about this push back and think, I don't have time. I don't have time or expertise to be on top of the subject matter I'm teaching. Now I'm supposed to be evaluating whether students are appropriate, right? Like that's a whole nother layer. And it's true. And I don't blame my colleagues for feeling like that. So I think sometimes the blanket prohibition almost feels necessary, not because they're Luddites who are against the technology, but they just don't feel like they're in the weeds to be able to get there with the students. And I don't know that I have a great solution for that, but I think the nuance you raise is just so important. And like Laurel said, that's real life, right? Laurel's firm or department might have a policy prohibiting X type of tools and allowing ABC type of tools. So I think that's a great point.
And I'll just add quickly a bit from the student's perspective. Diane, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying, that professors, they're busy, especially adjuncts, they have another job on top of their teaching. So staying on top of all the latest AI tools and what they can and cannot do is difficult. But like Laurel said, this is real life, and this is going to be our world for the next foreseeable future. And so I think it's inevitable that they'll have to start finding the resources to understand these, at least at a basic level. And from the student's perspective, it's really helpful to understand what the professor is and is not okay with. Like you said, is it okay to create an outline? Is it okay to brief a case? Is it okay to have your paper proofread by AI? Whatever it may be, every professor is going to have different boundaries. But I think a lot of students so far are experiencing that professors just either are not mentioning it at all when they go over the syllabus at the beginning of the semester, or it is just a blanket, like you can't use it whatsoever. And I think that causes some confusion among students because AI is pervasive. I mean, the new Apple update just put AI in like our texts and emails. So it does cause a little bit of confusion because it is everywhere. So having that guidance at the start of the semester, I think, is really helpful for understanding how you can and cannot use it.
I also definitely think that there needs to be some education around what kinds of AI, and what by that I mean AI is an umbrella term, right? And so there's machine learning, there's generative AI, and helping people understand, and especially students understand, like there's when we say no AI, do we mean really no generative AI, no chat GPT, none of that? Because respectfully to anybody who's completely forbidding AI, your students have been using machine learning based stuff for 15 years. There's probably no way that any of us know how to do certain things without those operations in life anymore. And that's okay, right? But I can see how that can create then quite a bit of confusion around that. And I think that there's so much public, information about, and so many cheap subscriptions, relatively speaking. Sometimes I look at like the grammar schools, the elementary schools. I had a student who asked for advice on an LSAT, and I proceeded to give a whole bunch of advice about filling out a Scantron to find out she's never used a Scantron ever in her entire life. And which case I said, well, every piece of advice I can provide you on this is no longer relevant, clearly. And I think it kind of goes to that sort of mindset, right? Like elementary schools now, they don't give out textbooks, a lot of them. They hand out iPads that have all of the books. And so the methodology for like highlighting and taking notes is so incredibly different than it was like when I was a student. Or growing up. And I think we have to look at it through the lens of there are certain skill sets that we may not need to sort of teach as much anymore because they're just going to be inherent. I think we all probably, a lot of us at least, grew up in the era of teachers telling us you won't have a calculator every day. You're going to need to know how to do this. And we all now walk around with a calculator in our pocket. And so I think there's some adjustment that we'll need to do to make sure that we're not sort of keeping us behind or keeping students behind just to perfect skills that were once something that couldn't be done through a computer, but now can be.
And if I can offer to maybe wrap us up a little bit on a positive note, I think transparency here is key, right? So, Ken said how can I be expected to teach all this? I've had colleagues that just tell students that, look, I prohibit it because my focus is on securities regulation with you. And I want to, right, and just kind of be in the weeds with them. And I try to do that with my students of, I'm not the expert here, I'm learning alongside you. And it's just been so positive, the students' response to that, because they'll see right through us. Who are we kidding, right? So I think building in that transparency, or maybe the last 5 minutes of every class, let's do some prompts together on the subject matter that we're talking about today, and just kind of see what happens. So if I can, offer that in the spirit of a positive relationship with students around this technology, I think transparency is just has to be the name of the game for anyone teaching right now.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to our amazing audience. So the next webinar in this series is going to be on Wednesday, April 9th from 6 to 7 again, and it's going to be about how to enhance animal law engagement. So I hope everyone can join us for that. This webinar, like all of the others in the series, has been recorded and it will be posted to our YouTube channel. So feel free to go back and watch it or send it to a friend who might have missed it. Thank you all so much for coming. Have a great night.